Welcome to this talk. Before we begin, I'm Joe Sachs from the law school from Bolt Hall, and I'm going to introduce our speaker, but Linda has just a couple of announcements to make before we begin.
Thank you, Professor Sachs. For those of you who are regulars, forgive me for repeating some of the things you've heard before, but for those who are new, just to let you know that in the back on a table, we have a sign-up sheet if you would like to get on an email list to receive a reminder about the lectures a week before each lecture. And we also have some information about the water archives. We have a brochure. We also have a Colloquium brochure, and we have some postcards that are free, and also membership cards if you want to become a member of the Water Archives. And I would like to introduce Renata Andrade, because who is the lecturer for the seminar this semester. The Colloquium is also a one-unit seminar, and she is the teacher, and so she has an announcement to make.
Welcome everyone. My name is Renata Andrade, and I am host of the Energy and Resources Group and the Landscape Architecture. So I hope that many of you still have a chance, if you want to participate of the discussions. We're going to be meeting in 2 weeks at the CalFed Science Conference to discuss the paper by Professor Justice Hobbs, and as well we have other reading lists that are posted on the website. So I'm going to circulate some of this announcement, and then I hope that you can join us for the next discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, and then we're also hoping that the seminar will continue in the spring as a new course. So we're hoping to get the word out much more in advance next semester. And with that, I'd give the mic back to Professor Sachs.
Thanks, Linda. As you all know, one of the great challenges in introducing a speaker who has a fantastic career is to discipline yourself so that you don't talk longer introducing him than he talks in giving his speech, and I'm going to do that as much as I can. As you know, we're very honored to have Justice Greg Hobbs of the Supreme Court of Colorado to deliver our seminar talk tonight. Justice Hobbs is a graduate of the law school, Bolt Hall, and has had a most extraordinary and impressive career. He has been an attorney, both representing the government in the Attorney General's office in the state of Colorado, and also with the Environmental Protection Agency. He worked with a distinguished firm in Denver and then opened his own firm. He is, beyond dispute, one of the most knowledgeable and most accomplished experts on water law anywhere in the United States. And his work, both as a practicing attorney and during the last 10 years or so, I'm not sure of the exact dates, but about 10 years, as justice on the Colorado Supreme Court, has been the author, of course, not only in the water law area, but in other areas in which he has expertise in the land use and transportation area, has really added measurably and notably to the body of Western water law. And I'm honored to be an acquaintance of his and to have had the opportunity to read his writings, which are not limited only to judicial opinions, but he is also a poet of remarkable standing. And I don't know if he's going to read any of his poems to us tonight, but that would be an extra treat, as long as they're not anti-California, pro-Colorado poems. Without further ado, and with thanks in advance for gracing us with your presence, Justice Gregory Hobbs.
Thank you, Joe. Well, it's a great honor and privilege to be back at my alma mater, my professional alma mater. I'm an undergraduate from Notre Dame. Last time I saw Notre Dame is when I graduated. Yeah, the wind off of Lake Michigan is fairly severe. The only time that's decent during the year there is actually football season. But at that school, if you lose one game, the whole season's ruined. And congratulations to the Golden Bears. I spent 3 wonderful years here at Bolt Hole, and I couldn't be more grateful for that professional opportunity and for the faculty and fellow students that I met here. And I participated in our 35th class reunion last weekend here, so I'm glad to be back again. Professor Sachs invited me to this forum over a year ago. I'm very pleased you're here. I hope that you will enjoy this evening, because I don't think there's any greater topic than water. Water touches life everywhere, and I'm sure you're here because you know that and you have some professional relationship to water, or even if you don't, through the literature that you've read, through the sites you've seen. And I want to review some of those sites with you. But Joe invited me to read a poem, did you not, Joe? So actually, since I have written water poetry for over 4 decades, longer than I've been a lawyer, I will try to integrate some of that poetry with the talk tonight. But I want to read the opening stanzas of a poem by W.B. Yeats, The Song of Wandering Angus. I'm certain that you know this poem. And remarkably, in the first stanza, it's a water poem, of course. I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. And when I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire of flame, but something rustled on the floor, and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Well, that's a creation myth, is it not? All the creation myths of the great religions and of all peoples, and particularly of the Native Americans, deal most remarkably with water. And so when I had a chance to write a poem in celebration of Colorado's in-stream flow law on its 30th anniversary, and I'm going to start at the headwaters, okay? California is one of the Colorado River Basin states, as you know, but 70% of the water comes from Colorado. So if I may, please. You know, I'm a Californian too, you know? Licensed to practice in California. As a poet, don't need a license anywhere. Colorado, mother of rivers. When I was young, the water sang of being here before I am, of falling sweet and soft and slow to berry bog and high meadow, and held me in her lap and cooed the willow roots, the gaining pools, and called me through bright dappled grass, and called me, oh, my shining one, and shaped a bed to lay me on, and played the flute so high and clear, and shaped the stones to carry me when I am young and full of fight, for roaring here and roaring there, for pouring torrents in the air, when I am young as mountain snow in crag and cleft and cracked window. I call the greenback cutthroat trout, I call the nymph and hellgrammite, I call the hatch to catch a wind, I call upon the mountain track, I call the scarlet to the jaw, as morning calls her own hatchlings, call Yampa, White, the Rio Grande, San Juan, the Platte, the Arkansas. Celebration of the 30th year of Colorado's in-stream flow law, a remarkable innovation in the prior appropriation doctrine. All right, but you know, the history of water in the Americas, that's what I'm talking about, but you could replicate this history throughout the globe. You know that. But I here talk about the Western Americas. Now, when I talk about the Americas, I was taught when I served in the Peace Corps with my wife in South America in 1967-68 that the Americas include North America, Central America, and South America. So I want to talk about water scarcity and water institutions to begin this talk tonight with you, talking about the lay of the land of the Americas and the lay of civilization upon that land. And so here you see some of the 13 irrigated agricultural terraces at Tipon, which is 13 miles down valley from Cusco, Peru, located at 12,000 feet in elevation. I want to talk also about Machu Picchu, which is in the saddle between Huayna Picchu and Machu Picchu Mountain at about 8,500 feet closer to the Amazon. Now, how many of you have been to this area of Peru? Wonderful. You live there? Yeah. For how long? Ah, okay. Well, this, you know, part of the joy of the water field actually is seeing what is done with water around the world. And the science now and practice of paleo-hydrology is looking at ancient waterworks and making some remarkable conclusions, which ought to be readily apparent to us. Water necessary always for the organization of community and for survival. So now we're not going to be talking about Roman aqueducts here, folks. Some of these structures that are in the Americas predate that, and they developed their own technologies. Remarkably, the Peruvians, the Andeans, did not have the wheel. They did not use mortar on stones. They shaped the stones and fit them together. They built great foundations for their stonework. 60% of Machu Picchu, for example, is underground because the foundations of these walls that have withstood centuries are based upon good practice of the foundations being built first. So let me turn first to Tipon. There is a new book just published called Tipon by Kenneth Wright, who is a Colorado water engineer, senior water engineer. He and his wife, Ruth, a former legislator of the Colorado General Assembly, have a paleo-hydrology institute and been working with archaeologists in Peru and at Mesa Verde in Colorado to document and survey the ancient waterworks. So Tipon, Ken Wright calls a water garden. I had the chance to visit this site last year. If you go back to Peru and you haven't seen it, please go see it. Now, the background of this is that the Tiwanaku culture, the Wari culture, the Bukhara culture, the peoples that inhabited the Lake Titicaca area have been practicing irrigation and the design of magnificent ceremonial water and drinking fountains for 2,500 years now, dating back 500 BC. The Inca, of course, were around 1450 to 1550 before the Spanish came in and extinguished them. But the Inca are simply other governmental organizers for people that have existed in the Andes and developed these community water institutions long before the Inca put in the 3,000 miles of roads and perfected sites like Tipon and Machu Picchu. So irrigation on this Tipon site has been probably in existence since 200, 300 AD. Now, you can't enter Tipon without hearing the working and singing waters. It literally is a water garden. Splash pools, water coming down off of the 13 irrigated terraces. They grew corn and quinoa. Those are the flying Quechua steps, you know. These people were nimble. That's how they got up to the top of these walls. You will see the water cascading down the sides of these walls. There you go, again, an idea of the 13 terraces laid out. The soil was brought from the valleys up into these areas after the foundations were built and the stonework was put in. You can see the canal there to the right. The water for the Tipon site comes from a river diversion a mile away, bifurcates into 3 canals at the Tipon site, and this is a perennial spring, which is right at the heart and head of the site. The Inca, as many native peoples did, revered water, thought it had a spirit of its own. They would actually sacrifice llamas and spread the ashes on the water. They considered water sacred. Here is our ceremonial fountain with 4 beautiful jets of water being fed by this perennial spring. Magnificent structure in itself, but very symbolic spiritually and its utilitarian purpose for domestic drinking water. Notice how the drainage is built across these walls. There's the canal coming down through the site. dropping down into the Cusco Valley. These irrigation systems are still in use. There's the irrigated fields, the fountain again. Notice throughout they practice great drainage. Part of irrigation, of course, is to get the water that is not taken up by the crop drained out. Close up of the fountain. Now, here's the ice core data. We are learning much more, not only from paleo-hydrology, but from the study of precipitation and floods and droughts. And I'm always interested by the ice core data and the tree ring data, because what does it look like? As a Coloradoan, I think it looks like the Great Divide. You know, you probably think it looks like the Sierra. The mountains where the snows are, the good water use. The valleys, the droughts. Now that goes back quite a bit, this diagram, but the main message of it is that there are plenty of very dry, prolonged cycles in the Western Americas. Again, this is the ice core data. You see that bar right there in the middle of the graph? That's 1,000 years of decline in water yields that correspond basically to the drought up in Mesa Verde, interestingly enough, the prolonged drought period. Machu Picchu's up there where the arrow is during a relatively wet time. In fact, the little ice age. You can see then again how in more recent times the droughts recur. So this is a replicated pattern. In the West, we are used to, in modern times, to 3-year droughts every 20, 25 years. It seems to be a regular, almost recurring event. But what these ice core data and tree ring data studies show is they're much more prolonged, 20 to 50-year drought periods and long, sustained dry periods lasting over a century, century and a half. So these climate studies and the adaptation of these people to the inherited ancestral knowledge about water and drought is very key to these community institutions. Now, during this very dry cycle here, the Tiwanaku culture, that's in Bolivia, the site in Bolivia near Titicaca, was a great ceremonial and urban center, literally dried up, and the people retreated back into the hills. Now, they didn't disappear. They retreated back into places like Tapone and marshaled their community resources and did their river diversions and tapping the perennial springs and grew their crops. But the great ceremonial center seemed to have grown up when water supply was plentiful and they could grow a lot of food and et cetera. So the flowering of civilization, when you have the good water times, they sort of hang on, see how we can survive if not. Now the Incas perfected their governmental systems by exacting a labor tax. 3 months out of the year, the males were expected to work on government water and food supply projects. And the Incas had granaries throughout their extent to basically feed the people, particularly during dry times, like Joseph and the Pharaoh, you know. Store in times of plenty for the times of want. And of course, what they were storing was grain. They were also moving water to do that. So now here's Machu Picchu, great ceremonial center of the Inca between two mountains, the Urubamba Valley and that river circling around Huanea Picchu Peak, which you see in the middle. A canal tapping a perennial spring at Machu Picchu Mountain, bringing water into the heart of the great ceremonial center. Now, the work of the Wrights and the Peruvian archaeologists have restored the 16 fountains down the grand staircase of Machu Picchu. Again, you cannot enter this site without singing surrounding you, the working and the singing waters. These fountains are terrific from an aesthetic viewpoint, and they make the walking through of Machu Picchu very enjoyable. But again, they were used by the Quechua people, the Inca, to, in effect, wash, cleanse themselves, bless themselves, and for a drinking water supply. Now, since Machu Picchu is closer to the Amazon they were able to be, in effect, dryland farmers on their agricultural terraces. They did not irrigate with these fountains. You can see how beautiful when the light hits this water supply and how it's shaped to carry down that staircase. There's that canal again. And just so I read the poem that I wrote after seeing this, 16 fountains. Down a granite staircase, 16 fountains carry the spring falling from the sun gate high on Machu Picchu mountain. You can hear the mountain singing hands of master craftsmen scoring stone with hammer rock and praying Pachamama to the temple of the arcing sun, jetting water out when water runs for rock and men, and all is feminine. Mother Earth. That's what they were celebrating. And there's stone wakas throughout Machu Picchu that mirror the mountains they were looking out on, and these fountains singing to you. The agricultural terraces at Machu Picchu, of course, where they're going corn and quinoa. Now we come to Mesa Verde in Colorado. The 100th year of Mesa Verde National Park is this year. The work of the Rights and the Park Service archaeologists have documented 4 reservoirs that existed at Mesa Verde and were operated between 750 and 1180 AD. Reservoirs. 2 mesa top reservoirs and 2 canyon reservoirs. Now this is the Farview Village. Most of Mesa Verde is inaccessible. There are over 5,000 documented sites and there are artifacts all over the ground. But this site, the Farview Village, this being a kiva here, where it is said, of course, that the men had their ceremonies there and women were excluded. Now the archaeologists think, and you know, usually people are more sensible than this, that people lived in these, families lived in these during the harsh winters, you know, because you didn't have the wind coming through them. So, in fact, when you look at these kivas, they have air shafts, and they have smoke holes, and it's very plausible that these were not only religious ceremonial areas, but actually living spaces during the winters, and then of course they come out and live above ground during the summers. Now I've always been fascinated by this pictograph here, petroglyph, I don't know, maybe it's a petroglyph. Maybe someone will explain to me the difference, but anyway, this carved spiral coming from the center. Now the Hopi interpret this, and they claim to be descendants of the Mesa Verde Puebloans, as the emergence of the people from underground. But you notice it also looks like a spring, a welling out, again, the water source. This is the Farview Village, and here is the reservoir that was used by the Farview Village people, again, not for irrigation because they can only get their water in stormwater runoff. They were dryland farmers in Mesa Verde. The archaeologists used to think this was a dance platform. Of course, you know the Native Americans are always dancing, right? Kicking up their heels and having a good old time. Well, no. They are praying that the planting of the seed will result in bountiful produce that they can store and survive, and then they give thanks by dancing and singing when the harvest is in and at other appropriate times of the year. No, these were mounded, sedimented in reservoirs, some of which were in operation for 350 years, and the ancient Puebloans had nothing more than sticks, deer antlers, and baskets to scoop the sediment out. They didn't have, you know, tractors. They didn't have the wheel, you know. What did they have? Each other. They had community organization to supply the drinking water source that they knew they had to bank on, as supplemented by spring seeps and little cisterns. When you go into a ruin like Mug House in Mesa Verde, you can look straight up to the rim rock and you can see a pour-off spout, and right next to the village they have built a cistern, a water cistern to catch that runoff. So they were harvesting water in every way they could in this dry land. There again is the Farview Reservoir, which you can actually see on Chapin Mesa now, accessible to the public. And now in the year 2003, I was able to visit with the Rights with a team of 25 experts with various backgrounds to survey the fourth reservoir site. Now, this only became visible because of a fire in Mesa Verde in the year 2000, the Bircher Fire, that burned through this area and revealed this mound. Now, by this time, they're onto it. This is probably not a dance platform. So this survey is to see how deep the reservoir was and to document that it was actually a reservoir. There you go. You see the intermittent stream channel. Now, what happened apparently, they would start building these bottom canyon reservoirs right in the stream bed, the intermittent stream bed. They would try to intercept in good water years groundwater. The stream bed, of course, would start to work around as they would take the sediment out that would come in with the water, and they would throw it out on a berm, and of course then a dam, a reservoir structure would start to be formed, and the stream would work around it. There's that stream bed now with a clear outline of the berm of the reservoir. Here's a archaeologist looking down on the site where a portable Bureau of Reclamation drill rig has been brought in to core sample with the NRCS soil scientists the depth of the reservoir. Here are the kind of artifacts that are just laying all over the ground. While we were in there, we used a global positioning unit to document and inventory these artifacts. There's my wife holding one of these stone implements, a hammer stone or an axe head. The portable drill rig, the Bureau of Reclamation, and Dick Wiltshire of the Bureau there with his hands on the rig, and Doug Ramsey, a soil scientist for the NRCS. The cores were extruded. They showed that the reservoir was 21 feet deep. We also explored the upper watershed. This is the watershed that feeds that reservoir. There's Ken Wright and myself looking at an armor stone. We were able to document that the diversion canal into this reservoir ended up being about 1,400 feet long because as the stream would work around this berm, as the berm built up, you had to go upstream to intercept the creek to get the water into the reservoir. They armored the sides of these canals to prevent erosion. So we were able to document the alignment of the ditch that fed the reservoir by finding these armor stones still poking out in some places. There are the stones, the armor stones marking the alignment of the diversion canal in the next canyon over, Moorfield Canyon, that also has a bottom canyon reservoir similar to the one that we were surveying in 2003 in the Prater Canyon. Now we're to the San Luis Valley in Colorado. You're looking at the oldest water right, continuous water right in Colorado. It dates to 1852, when Hispano settlers from New Mexico came up and settled on the Sangre de Cristo land grant. The Sangre de Cristo grant was a Mexican grant. You remember in 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo brought New Mexico and what is now the west and south slope of Colorado, including the San Luis Valley, into the United States. Now, one of the provisions of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was that the Mexican land grants would be recognized. So the people settling on this ditch, 1852, the San Luis People's Ditch is constructed, has been in continuous use since that time, and since Colorado recognizes the doctrine of prior appropriation, we recognize a water right here that predated the 1861 formation of Colorado. This acequia culture grew directly out of northern New Mexico acequia communities. There were 350 of these acequias, direct flow water ditches, operating in New Mexico by the mid-1800s. That goes back to Moorish Spain. In Granada, the working of the water, if you've been to the Alhambra, how many of you have been to the Alhambra? Again, what more of a demonstration of the working and singing waters than that magnificent place. So there's a direct technology transfer here that comes through the Hispano line too into Colorado. In fact, one of Colorado's earliest governors, Ben Eaton, who was in the territorial legislature and the Colorado Constitutional Convention when the Constitution of Colorado adopted the doctrine of prior appropriation in 1876. He learned how to work water on the Cimarron in Cimarron, New Mexico, outside the Philmont Scout Ranch, where it now is, on the Maxwell land grant, an acequia community ditch. And then when he went and founded his homestead in 1864 on the Poudre in Colorado under the 1862 Homestead Act, an act of Congress that allowed you to get the title to the surface if you lived on it for 5 years and had 160 acres. He dug a direct flow ditch, 1864. Along comes the Union Colony in 1870. Horace Greeley, go west, young man. It's actually the women that were the stickers lots of times. He sent Nathan Meeker out. Greeley stayed in New York writing newspapers. They settled on a sagebrush plain near the Poudre and the Platte. Their first attempt at digging a ditch was a complete failure, and Ben Eaton, just upstream from them, showed them how to build their 2 successful ditches. Direct technology transfer, because Ben Eaton learned how to do that from working on a Mexican land grant in northern New Mexico. After he busted out as a miner in 1859, when the 59ers came to Colorado after gold had been discovered at the confluence of Cherry Creek and the Platte and in the Pikes Peak gold field. Now, here is the later Anglo immigration in the San Luis Valley. They pipe in their water here into a reservoir going across a drainage way from the community acequias that are the older water rights. There's a head gate with a lock on it. Under Colorado water law, when you're not in priority because the natural water supply is not sufficient, the water commissioners have authority to lock down the head gate. If you bust the lock, you're subject to penalties, triple penalties, and injunction. So the water commissioners are the one that know who settled first, what rights are where, and administer the water in order of settled rights. Settled rights is the doctrine because those who come later can see what's on the ground. The law is beneficial use without waste, based upon actual use of the water. The water is always in the public domain. It's a public water resource. All you can get is a use right. You get the use right by applying the water to beneficial use. Here is one of the direct descendants of the original settlers on the Sangre de Cristo land grant. That's his lateral onto his field. This is not his day in rotation. The rotation of water is every third day under his particular ditch. So we just happened to visit when the water wasn't on. The mountains in the background, the Sangre de Cristo. You're now on the west side of the Sangre de Cristo range, beautiful range. We had a decision in 2002, which I was able to participate in the majority, recognizing the restoration of the rights of the settlers on the Sangre de Cristo grant and their descendants to access onto a 77,000-acre stretch that had been community access property that Jack Taylor, a man from North Carolina, bought and fenced the descendants off from in 1960. It took that long for it to wind through the state and federal courts. In a handwritten deed, Carlos Beaubien, the holder of the Mexican land grant, conveyed title to the property to William Gilpin, our first territorial governor in Colorado, after he got bounced out of office because he issued script to send Chivington down to head the Confederates off at Glorieta Pass as they were going in to seize Santa Fe, issued the script without authority, and the government didn't honor it. So Gilpin became very unpopular. After 13 years as territorial governor, Lincoln removed him, and he went and tried to establish this empire in the San Luis Valley by getting this land grant territory from Carlos Beaubien, who succeeded to it when his son Narciso, who was 16 years old, and Sheriff Lee of Taos were killed in the Taos uprising. Now there's a little bit of shenanigans here because Mexican law didn't allow aggregation of a huge amount of territory, and Beaubien already had his own Beaubien-Miranda grant that became the Maxwell grant. He really wasn't entitled to have this other Sangre de Cristo grant, but ended up with it because his son was killed and he bought out the interests of the Sheriff Lee descendants. So we recognize the right of the settlers to take their animals up, livestock, and graze on this land, to harvest firewood, and to take timber to build their houses, because that's what Beaubien in this handwritten deed had provided. You couldn't obviously turn the livestock out on the agricultural strips because you had to grow the crops on the strips. You used the upland for timber and for mountain meadow grazing. So it's really amazing how in public land law states like Colorado, you revisit in real estate and water, in land use and other areas, some of the foundational principles of use rights, of the public domain, of the Mexican land grants, which after all were the only non-federal property when Colorado became a state in 1861, you know. To get any foothold in a public land grant state or public land state, you had to get some kind of possessory interest or claim of right or homestead or, you know, to get any right except on the land grants where that land came into the Union under the 1848 treaty. This is the Colorado River. Now, that is not a bird in the center there. That is a Border Patrol helicopter. I am standing on the Morelos Dam here, looking up towards the United States in Mexican territory. That is the Morelos Dam. The Colorado River takes a right-hand turn into the Morelos Dam to supply 3 canals in Mexico. The top water priority on the Colorado River, based on the 1944 treaty between the United States and Mexico, 1,500,000 acre-feet a year is delivered to Mexico. Basically, the Morelos Dam is the primary point of diversion. In good water years, Mexico's entitled 1,700,000 acre-feet when surplus is available. Now, this is just a factual inquiry. I'm not going to substitute any judgments on what I'm about to show you, okay? So bear with me. All right, there is the drainage way for the Morelos Dam. I'm standing on it where the diversion is taking place. That is the bed of the Colorado River there, what's left of it, the seep water from the dam. There's a better picture of it. That's the main stream of the Colorado pre-dam, okay, post-dam. Now this is the Welton Mohawk drainage way. This drains a district, an agricultural district in Arizona. 44,000 acre-feet of saline water come across the border in this canal and go into the last vestigial wetland, which is basically supplied by the saline drainage from the United States, the La Ciegna wetland. Certainly a wonderful area to see. How many of you have ever seen that down in the Delta? Absolutely. Salt marsh, I would describe it. You can get on a boat and go through it. There are lots of birds. It's a wonderful place. Now, on the right hand there, you see the Colorado River, right? Now, before I get back to the Colorado River, I want to point out this pump. This is in the area of Mexicali. This is a high-capacity irrigation pump. It is pumping water from the All-American Canal. The All-American Canal is in that sand dune. Now I'm looking straight at it. Now you're looking straight at it. It's unlined at the present time. Approximately 77,000 acre-foot of water a year seep out of the All-American Canal and end up in Mexico. Now, I think in some years it's something maybe up to 100,000 acre-feet, but I guess an average might be 67 to 77,000 acre-feet. Now, the seepage water is claimed by the United States, California interests as part of the water that they're entitled to under the compact. Some of this is in dispute, but the outline of the controversy is this. To wheel water to San Diego, the Imperial Irrigation District and the United States have supported, along with other California entities, the lining of the All-American Canal to salvage or conserve this water. Now, one person's water salvage is another person's water treasure, all right? In this case, it's the Mexicans who for decades have been irrigating with those high-capacity pumps, taking the water right out of the shallow groundwater seep from the All-American Canal, and they have a very productive economy down there and some wetlands and other things that are basically based on this seep water. So the All-American Canal, again, in American territory, where I'm standing right beside that irrigation pump. Let's look again at the Colorado River on the right, the Welton Mohawk saline drainage on the left. See if you can spot the water. The main stem of the Colorado River, upstream and downstream, that being upstream underneath the bridge. The Grand Canyon. I'm standing in the midst of the Grand Canyon here, and of course one of the great adventures of a lifetime, other than visiting Machu Picchu and Tapón, is to raft the Grand Canyon. I've been able to do that twice, once with my brother Will on a float boat. Will is the author of young adult adventure stories. Will Hobbs out of Durango. He's written 16 young adult adventure stories. 2 are set on the Colorado River, downriver and River Thunder. He knows what he's talking about. He's rafted the Colorado River 10 times. This picture here was taken when I took the second trip, which was a Hatch River Expedition motorized trip, fully gourmet outfitted trip, coffee in the morning, cocktails on the beach in the afternoon, motor through the flat water so you can do a lot of side hikes. You know, when you're in one of those oar boats, there's a lot of rowing in places like Marble Canyon. Now, here is the counterpart to the ice core data I showed you in Peru. This is the tree ring studies done by Connie Woodhouse and her colleagues out of the NOAA laboratory outside of Boulder, Colorado. Now, this is startling. Now, again, it's replicated, you know, the mountains and the valleys, the flood times and the drought times. She has documented 20-year periods of extremely dry conditions that have recurred in the Colorado River Basin since the year 500. The wettest non-overlapping 20-year averages are on the left. The droughts are on the right. The big droughts of the 1500s, 1600s, the 1800s, the mid-1600s again are mapped here through studying the rings of trees. So one of the many arguments for ancient trees involves the fact that we can learn about our climate and science and the way people have been able to survive in the Western Americas through the study of the tree rings. Now, it's interesting to see now, you're looking at the year 1900 there, you see that big spike up there? That's, of course, when the Colorado River Compact of 1922 was negotiated. And they didn't have the advantage of these tree ring studies to show these many 20-year periods of severe dry conditions, and there are some events that have gone into 50 years. As I said, the modern planning for water projects is about 3 years based on the 1950s drought. So this is very sobering data. And I like to honor the trees. Oh, ring bearers of the Rocky Mountain West, pinyon, ponderosa, Doug fir, bristlecone, packed to the core, tenacious recorders. You stand watch on mountain upslopes, foothill, arroyo, downslopes. May we borrow your driest, your brimful memories. We have need of your common signals for seasons of want. Stay together close. Expand to greet all sufficient opportunity in tall grass lupin summers. Of course, you know, the tree rings are real tight in the drought periods, and they expand when there's an ample water supply. There's no ignorance stored in you. The nearer we penetrate, ours relents, community solitude. Gregarious, you spread your knowledge concentrically, like planets around a center fire do, unevenly. Make it stand grandly in the place you've chosen. Populate hills of light given you. How they shrink or swell, you ensemble streams and rivers marked within. May we call you by your names, seldom wanderers, stress abiders, constant conservators, great divide sentinels. So how this tree ring science works is that they correlate what we know in the modern era of stream gauges, which is only 150 years, and they look at the tree rings and in various parts of the Colorado River Basin, and so they have calibrated the modern studies of actual flow with what shows up in the tree rings, and have plotted this line that goes back to the 1500s. So the Colorado River Compact is divided up on the basis that the Compact commissioners thought there was about 17 million acre feet, and they knew that Mexico was going to have to get something out of that. So they divided at Leaf Ferry 7.5 million acre feet a year on the average to the lower basin, and 7.5 million acre feet to the upper basin. Now, the lower basin negotiators were very savvy. They wanted a guarantee from the upper basin of deliveries because they realized that Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico were trying to get a a perpetual allocation of water and really didn't have the growth foreseen that places like the Imperial Valley and the rising Los Angeles area had. So that if prior appropriation went across the boundaries, the inevitable impact would be, based on the doctrine of equitable apportionment before the Supreme Court on interstate rivers, is that prior appropriation might trump. Those who develop first, get the water. So why is the Upper Basin interested in this compact? To get a perpetual guarantee for its own future. Well, in the first meeting in 1922 in Washington, D.C., the negotiator from Colorado, Delph Carpenter, comes with a couple of exhibits. And one of the exhibits was a potential dam above Lee Ferry, where Lake Powell now is, that would hold 52 million acre-feet of water. The state engineer, Ralph Meeker, at that time, had drawn up this exhibit. The lower basin, he shows a reservoir where Lake Mead now is of 30 million acre-feet. Now, Colorado and the upper basin wanted these discussions before the lower basin got anything like a major reservoir on the river, okay, which turned out to be Lake Mead, built through the Boulder Canyon Project Act in 1928. So the Coloradans weren't completely ignorant, by the way, that there had been drought periods, because the 1890s was a severe drought period in the western United States and in Colorado. So let's don't think that they were dumb. Carpenter did not want an annual guarantee at Lee Ferry, which is what Norville of Arizona wanted. He wanted a minimum guarantee delivered every year. What came out in the compact was a 75 million acre-feet, 10-year running average, where the upper basin could not deplete the stream, so that could not be bypassed in that amount. So Carpenter and the upper basin negotiators had to give the lower basin a guarantee of some sort of deliveries, okay? Hoover, who was the compact chair, the Commerce Secretary, later became president, talks openly in the compact negotiations about the need for storage on the Colorado River in view of times where there may be drought. So, but they were Western optimists, right? So you see that peak? The other exhibit that Delph Carpenter had when he came to the table to the compact was an irrigation survey. Now, all the 7 states were figuring, well, they would divide the Colorado River by how much irrigable land they had within their state. They just so happen on this one exhibit shows 20 million acre-feet of water available from the Colorado River virgin supply, and lo and behold, if there isn't about 20 million acres of agricultural land that can be irrigated. Of course, the states can't agree on a division of the waters in that fashion, or that the other states really had that much that could be irrigated. Now, you have to remember that these folks are products. Even though civilization is changing dramatically, these people are products of John Wesley Powell's and the Thomas Jefferson idea that the future of the West was going to be the perpetual agriculture democracy. Okay? Well, that's what the Homestead Act and the 1902 Reclamation Act were kind of based on, but even as of 1902, when the Reclamation Act puts federal assistance into building water projects for agriculture, the society was already changing. So when these people are at the table negotiating the Colorado River Compact, they want to think on the bright side. They're also thinking about storage to regulate the river. The upper basin can't get its deal without this delivery obligation. And of course, the lower basin gets the Boulder Canyon Project Act. And because the lower basin states, Nevada, Arizona, and California, can't agree on an apportionment among themselves, which was not settled by the Colorado River Compact in 1922, Arizona doesn't sign the compact. The Boulder Canyon Project Act becomes a 6-state compact. The project is built, and then Arizona comes in later when it wins a suit against California based upon an apportionment that is accomplished under the federal Congress's provisions for the Boulder Canyon Project Act. 4.4 million acre-feet for California, 2.8 for Arizona, 300,000 acre-feet for Nevada. What's Nevada? It's just a little pueblo, huh? They don't need much water, so they didn't get much water. And of course, the whole leverage now is Nevada thinking that it didn't get a good bargain, but I'll have to tell you, the upper basin didn't think it got a good bargain either. Why do they now think that? Because the great drought of the 21st century has taken Lake Powell, which was built with a 26 million acre foot capacity, not 52 million, because the Rainbow Bridge couldn't be inundated. The environmental era had intervened. The Navajos considered Rainbow Bridge sacred, so there was a provision in the Colorado River Storage Project Act to prevent the filling to inundate Rainbow Bridge. So the upper basin ends up with 26 million acre feet of water. Very comfortable, you can deliver a 3-year supply down to the lower basin, figured out, 7.5 million a year, plus half of the Mexico Treaty obligation, 750,000. We're in good shape. 3-year cycle, right? Lake Powell, gets down to below 50% full, and it's quite a sight to see. I went down into the upper end of it on a raft trip through the Cataract Canyon into what used to be Height Marina. Height Marina is high and dry now, and all the settlement that has been poured into Lake Powell, is basically sitting up there in these big mounds of mud and sand that are collapsing back into the river, and the river is recovering 3 or 4 cataracts that had been inundated by Lake Powell, because that's what water will do now. So it's really something to see. But of course, the upper basin is very alarmed now about this guarantee of 75 million acre feet on a 10-year running average. So it turns out the lower basin got the better part of the deal. Of course, California got the better part of the deal of everybody, right? Because they exceeded their 4.4 allocation, started using water up to 5.2 million acre feet a year. But they have entered into an agreement with the basin states now and the Secretary of Interior to cut back to their true allocation. So here we go on the Grand Canyon, wonderful recreation site. The most managed river maybe in the world, when you think about it. A population of almost 30 million people in the Colorado River Basin, a compact that allows water to go outside of the natural basin of the Colorado River into any portion of the 7 compact states. Worries now about shortage and shortage criteria. There's the snake diagram out of Colorado. I told you as a headwaters person I was going to talk about the headwaters, didn't I? Here we go. Now spot where the Great Divide is. Spot where the puny prairie streams are, the Platte and the Arkansas. Spot where the Colorado River complex is that contributes 70% of the water supply at Lee Ferry, the west slope of Colorado. Now, as you know, the Colorado originates in Rocky Mountain National Park, right? Wrong. It used to be called the Grand. The Grand and the Green met in what's now Canyonlands to form the Colorado River. Ed Taylor, the West Slope congressman from Colorado, ran a rider on a bill in the 1920s to change the Grand River to the Colorado River so that Wyoming couldn't claim to be the headwaters of the Colorado River. And so this shows how, through an act of Congress, you can seize and move a river. In this case, the Colorado River to the headwaters in Rocky Mountain National Park. But you can see where the Great Divide lies. 85% of our population is on the plains, where the great farming areas is and the land to build the cities. But 80% of the water is on the west slope. So, trans-mountain diversion is a long, historically complicated and controversial matter, but the Colorado River Compact allows Colorado to use its allocation any place in Colorado, including on the other side of the divide. There again is the snake diagram. What are those fat things right at the borders? Colorado can only use 1/3 of the water supply that arises within the state. A year, yearly average would be 16 million acre feet. In the year 2002, our streams only produced 4 million acre feet, 1/4. Under the 9 interstate compacts and 3 equitable apportionment decrees, we have to deliver over 10 million acre feet a year out of state to 18 downstream states. So we are constrained by natural water availability and legal constraints because of the doctrine of sharing on interstate rivers, which is in the equitable apportionment jurisdiction of the United States Supreme Court, and in the alternative, a compact between the states approved by Congress. That's why we have 9 interstate compacts on our Colorado streams, so we could get a perpetual apportionment. The water divisions in Colorado were formed around major watersheds. This was our 1969 act. We have a water court in each of these major watersheds, the appeals come directly to the Colorado Supreme Court. So we see the direct water appeals from the water court. The only other priority set as high in Colorado by the legislature, the Court of Appeals, our intermediate court doesn't get water cases, and it doesn't get death penalty cases. Water and death. Those are the two top priorities. So we 7 justices of the Colorado Supreme Court do write water opinions on a regular basis. All right, I don't know whether the next slide is going to come up, but in any event, I wanted to show you the Blue River, which has a minimum stream flow on it, and that's going to end that right now. Just picture the Blue River on the west slope of Colorado. How many of you have been to Keystone, Breckenridge, Copper Mountain, et cetera? Well, you know the area. Dillon Reservoir is the upstream reservoir that takes water to Denver on the blue. The downstream reservoir is the Green Mountain Reservoir that takes water for the western slope and the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District. There's an in-stream flow filing between those two reservoirs. Now, what does this picture show now? The global warming is real in the eyes of water managers. When it becomes real, it's real. In the eyes of water managers. The Western Governors Association has put out a report on climate change and land use that wants to tie water use to land development in a way that I don't think the Western governors have ever talked about before. The literature is showing that the snowpack is diminishing, that the precipitation may come more in the form of rain rather than the snowpack that we have depended on in the past. There was a great dust event in Colorado this past year. We were supposed to have a great runoff from the central mountains, but because of the dry areas down in Arizona and in the central basin, apparently the winds picked up dust, deposited them on Colorado mountain slopes, and we had a runoff that didn't materialize because we had a lot of warming and evaporation. People had planted crops based on projected water supply, the snow pads, NRCS, and it didn't materialize. So there were crops burning up in the fields. We integrate our groundwater with the surface water in Colorado. We don't pretend that the groundwater doesn't contribute to the rivers. In fact, when the law defies nature, the law is an ass. And in the case of tributary groundwater, the rivers ride on the aquifers. And of course, senior water rights posited as direct flow ditches, these oldest water rights in Colorado dating to 1860 to feed the miners. We were cutting back priorities back to 1860, 1861 in the great drought year of 2000, and these wells pumping the Platte tributary groundwater kept going around like this in nice bright green circles. So we ended up with a big lawsuit in our court. We issued an order that required our state engineer to curtail junior well pumping. Now remember, these wells were not sunk into the mid-1950s when the high-capacity irrigation pump became available and rural electrification was spread out on the landscape. And this was a nice ample supply of water in the 50s drought. Turns out when the 2000 drought comes along, they're intercepting water that belongs to the senior ditches, now bought into by municipalities because we can buy and sell water rates, quantify the historic consumptive use made by the crop in the water courts, transfer that water to municipal use. That's the direction it's going. We're limited, as I said, natural scarcity and legal scarcity. So we have an active market. We enforce the priorities because the senior water rights are more valuable, but they're not more valuable if they aren't enforced. If you don't enforce the water rights system, a junior well pumper intercepting water that would otherwise go to the senior is as good a right. So we ordered that unless you place the depletion that you make to the stream when you're not in priority, considering the lag time, remember sometimes pumping ends up months or years before the water would otherwise be delivered. We now have augmentation plans where you can buy senior storage rights, for example, and replace the water to the stream so that you can pump out of priority. My only point in this is the same thing that all the peoples of the Americas have experienced. The water supply is short. The need grows as communities grow. There is now, one of the last two slides I was going to show you, is that when the compact was negotiated, there were 8 million people, more or less, in the 7 Colorado River Basin states. There are now 50 million. Okay? The population is growing. The water supply that nature provides is basically the same, and the emission of the greenhouse gases will change the runoff patterns in a marked degree. And I'm a believer now, as I said, when I see water managers now making plans based upon global warming effects, as well as the Vail ski area and other ski areas that depend on snowpack. They're calling for the control of the greenhouse gases so that these conditions aren't aggravated, and they're taking measures in the interim to try to anticipate a different runoff pattern, less water. The consequences of this are incredible. The pressure is going to be immense. I think that the senior water rights are going to become more and more valuable, obviously. We're going to have to figure out how to store water underground so we don't have the evaporation that some reservoirs have. We're still going to have reservoir structures. You cannot transfer water from agricultural to municipal use, which is a year-round use, agriculture being seasonal, without storing the water for the municipal use. The reservoirs will probably be off-stream. I don't see huge big dams being built mainstream anymore. We have the whole NEPA process that didn't exist when the Colorado River Storage Project Act developed Lake Powell and the backup compact reservoirs, Flaming Gorge, the Aspinall unit, Flaming Gorge being in Wyoming, the Aspinall unit in Colorado, and the Navajo project, New Mexico, the San Juan River. That's a whole battery of fulfilling this 75 million acre feet requirement. We have delivery to the lower basin. The NEPA process wasn't in place when Wayne Aspinall got, from Colorado, the Palisade Peach. They called him. He was on the House Interior Committee. He was the chair to offset the lower basin reservoirs. He was bound and determined he was going to get these upper basin reservoirs, and he delivered. Now, out of that, however, several projects that he wanted desperately, Echo Park in Dinosaur National Park and another reservoir in the Marble Canyon, were scrubbed off of the Colorado River Storage Project Act because the environmental movement now came forward and started protecting these federal designated places of great significance. And as you know, it didn't stop there. Aspinall had to accede to the 1964 Wilderness Act because times they were a-changing. And of course, you know, being a Coloradan, he wanted to be sure he got those water projects built, and he wanted to be sure that the wilderness areas were designated in the high mountains, not in the lower areas where you could interfere with upstream municipal and agricultural development. So he had the perfect situation in Colorado. He had these peaks with the snow. They could be wilderness, you know, and the rest of it was going to be Bureau of Land Management, and you could go ahead and keep building your water projects. And then he was voted out of office in the environmental decade, and you know, and now we live with a great public process. More people, not less, are interested in taking a responsibility for the watersheds they live in, the way water is used. Now, a sign of the times in this Scientific American, then I'm going to stop for questions here. I love the Scientific American because, not being a scientist, you know, I can read it. That's why I write water poetry and talk to people that don't understand water. Also, I authored this Citizen's Guide to Colorado Water Law. We have a Colorado Foundation for Water Education. This was its first publication to communicate to people and debunk the engineering and legal language that is the normal way to perpetuate the water club. You know, now the water truly is back in the public possession. And this Scientific American here, the October issue, has an article on the ancient water works outside of Oaxaca, Mexico, where they were operating canals and reservoirs going 2,500 years back, and this great article on global climate change by volcanoes, but also predicting that a century and a half from now, if we keep having the greenhouse gas emissions and the acceleration of it, that we will have a global-wide mass extinction of species like the volcanoes did over various times. Remember, it wasn't just a meteor. The great meteor discovery came out of Berkeley, right? I forget the gentleman's name. But it appears that a lot of these events that changed biology and the landforms were global warming from volcanoes. And if we continue on our own way, we may contribute our own kind of volcanic change. Particularly, these are manifested in the oceans, which are very important to our whole system. I'm going to stop there. That's a small walk on the landscape of the Western Americas. There are more articles obviously been written on this and can be written in all of these fields. And what I like is the fact that you've come all from different disciplines and background to be here tonight. Thank you very much. Question? No, let's pass the mic. Thanks. Can we get a mic over here? So, we need to do this for the videographer here, you know, and for the Water Archives collection. And if you haven't seen the collection, go visit it. And these colloquium presentations are being videotaped.
Yeah,
yes.
As these senior water rights get more valuable, and through climate change, as the as people are willing to pay higher and higher prices, and the water belongs to the public, how much does the water right holder get, and how much does the public get?
Okay, well, these are market transfers. And to give you an idea, when I was council for the Northern Colorado Water Conservancy District, an acre-foot share of the Colorado Big Thompson water was going for about $2,500 when I went on the court in 1996. Today it would go for about $17,000 an acre-foot. And that's just the right to have the share of water a year, okay? The capitalized right of buying it. In the Clear Creek Basin, water rights are being sold at $26,000 an acre-foot. The water is commanding much more than the crops that are grown on this land can command. Now, to get to your point here, the idea in a market transfer is to have the market set the price. The people that buy these basically are in two categories. Mostly municipal water entities who have a rate-paying public that can invest and doesn't have any basically good options because we're over-appropriated in the Platte, the Arkansas, and the Rio Grande. There's no more water to develop, okay? Our remaining water may be on the west slope, very expensive in big water years with lots of infrastructure involved with it. The public does not realize any direct payment when these transactions take place. Now, why is that? Because the use right belongs to the farmers, okay? They perfected the water through beneficial use. They applied it. They can stay in agriculture or they can sell the water supply to the city, or under new laws that the Colorado legislature and other states are adopting, you can have an option of a dry year lease. What is that? The farmers keep the perpetual water rights, but they enter into a lease that under certain dry year conditions, the historic consumptive use that would be assigned to that water right can be used by the cities, put in a water bank. Last year, the Colorado legislature adopted a rotational fallowing program. And the hope is that these agricultural ditches in the Platte and the Arkansas will pool water, rotate crops, do some fallowing, provide water so that they can keep the perpetual right in the agricultural area and produce some income rather than selling the permanent right. Okay? Keep going on. You're onto something here. You're going to ask me something about this system. Yes, sir. Over here. Is it right that the public doesn't share in the monetary payment?
Just like the compact, Colorado Compact was written at a time when there was a lot of water in the river.
Right.
The law of water rights were written in the 1850s.
Correct.
When the general concept was that land was so big that there were no limits. And now with increasing population, so the earlier constitutional articles that were written were full of rights to people. Mm-hmm. And only in the 1950s and later that we are thinking about responsibilities. Now, is there any way that, considering the fact that water and natural resources are limited and subject to degradation, is there any way that we can somehow get into the Constitution, in addition to the rights concept. The concept of responsibilities to go with it. In the Constitution, I don't know what kind of legal language one can write into the Constitution.
Well, there is some constitutional basis in California for water, and Professor Sachs has written on this extensively in his career, to be in a public trust for aspects of recreation and the environment that all rights presumably are subject to, the Mono Lake decision being the significant one. But here's the point I want to make, that under the federal law, the states and territories were given the right to develop their own water law. Okay? That was a basic decision Congress made in the 1866 Mining Act, so that when property rights to water, now it is a unique resource, are created, the state and federal constitutions arguably protect the value of that right so that the government cannot confiscate it. Okay? So when you're talking about changing constitutions, if you're going to take someone's private property use right, let me argue, or a city's water supply, you've got significant issues involved with the value of that resource. And in the United States, you can't simply, by governmental direction, convert to a public purpose somebody's valuable property. And make no mistake, water is the most valuable form of property, more valuable than land in the West, because land is not as valuable without the water supply. And in our state, the water rights can be severed from the land. Now, should that be so? My comment on that is I'm a judge. I apply the law, the statutes of the Constitution, the decisional case law, and if the people were to change that law and have a different system, it could probably operate if on unappropriated water if people hadn't had a vested water right in it. Could it operate retroactively on settled use rights? Is a huge problem, legal problem, and a community problem.
That's precisely my point, that if you set up rights and other principles at a time when we did not know enough about nature, and then if at a later time it becomes necessary, do the people have, maybe sometime in the future if it becomes absolutely necessary, some wording will get in.
Well,
But
well, let me just take that, where it should go. I agree with you. For instance, tributary groundwater, you know. Fortunately, in our state, all the water, surface and subsurface, has been recognized not as a private property right in of itself, but as a public resource to be allocated according to the laws. And since we have prior appropriation, we don't allow junior tributary water pumpers to intercept the water that goes to senior water rights. Now, although these are junior rights, bear with me here, the in-stream flows that the Colorado Water Conservation Board can hold and other states, state agencies can hold, become slotted in the priority system, as do the U.S. reserve water rights for the tribes under federal law, for wildlife refuges, for national parks and monuments. Those are slotted into the priority system. So, you know, when we think about this system, we got to recognize that on the ground and for valuable uses you want to make, there's nothing like a good water right enforceable, all right? Because administrations can come and go. Regulations can be changed, right? There can be periods of non-enforcement or enforcement. So that under a property use-based system where you can integrate environmental values, I would assert to you, now there's a big if there, and protect them against future changes of water rights and appropriations that would take the water to them, you have a system that at least is rational. Now, as you know, in South Africa, they reinstituted, sort of based on the public concept, a reordering, a big reordering of water and who can get it. Now, I would argue to you that the customs and values of the communities, of the indigenous communities and the historic communities, need to be recognized in the face of those who may come later and have more money. How would you do that best? To recognize the settled, developed rights in these indigenous communities over time. Why did I point to the Andean water uses going way back? Why do the Native Americans claim that they have ancestral water uses or uses based on the designation of their reservations, which are in the 1860s and 70s, that precede the Anglo development? Why are they working so hard to assert those rights and then ending up with settlements that recognize those rights? Is because they are valuable. Now, will they be able to lease and market those rights, to those who need them in neighboring communities? In fact, that is the backbone of a lot of these Native American settlements that are occurring, most notably the Gila River settlement in Arizona, which half of the Central Arizona Project water now, lo and behold, the Udall brothers, listen to this, Carl Hayden and so on, belongs to the Native Americans, right? Under conditions that they can help out their communities by leasing the water and getting revenue. So, these customs and values continue to shape the face of the law and the landscape and respond to actual communities. We can't just wholesale, in my view, reinvent the water system. We build on it, we adapt, we change, we recognize shortage. The 7 basin states now are working on shortage criteria where they are staring in the face that they may have prolonged shortages and they got to get along with each other. So they're talking about agricultural land fallowing, exchanges, dry year leases, desalinization, anything they can think of to try to serve this growing population, because the most urbanizing region in the entire United States is the Western Americas. And it's not the agrarian democracy. The other demand for water is into the environment. We now have land and water trusts that can convert some of these senior rights by purchase on the market into perpetual trusts to keep the land irrigated, to create refuges, and so on, so that the water isn't sold to cities. In Colorado, we use gambling money for that, because a provision of our Colorado Constitution initiated by the voters puts the gaming money into the hands of the great Outdoor Colorado Trust Board that operates independent of the legislature, who used to take the money and put it in prisons to buy land and water rights for the environment. Yes, sir.
Thank you. In 1922, when the compact was passed, the lower basin states were about twice the population of the upper basin states. Now they're 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
The upper basin states have never used their 7.5 million acre feet. And 3, the Mexican Delta is totally destroyed.
Okay.
Given all that, don't you think you should renegotiate the compact?
No, absolutely not. I'm from Colorado. Hey, the lower basin got a hell of a bad deal. Or, depending on the upper basin's view, got a heck of a good deal. Did Mexico get a bad deal? I don't know. That's in the hands of the United States and Mexico as to how much water is to go across there. By the way, I forgot to mention this lawsuit, which the district court in Nevada, interesting choice of forums there, has said that the seepage from the All-American Canal actually belongs to the United States and is subject to the compact and the treaty, and it's now up in the Ninth Circuit. There are some very interesting arguments in that. I commend to you the 3 decisions of the lower court. Will they stand? I don't know. It's up in the Ninth Circuit. You make an equitable argument for changing the compact. However, as I read the terms of the compact, it can't be changed unilaterally by any of the states. Does the Congress reserve its right to have an Endangered Species Act and a NEPA and the operation of federal projects that were built with federal money and a reoperation of the reservoirs? You bet. You bet. The compact did not preclude Congress from adopting the environmental laws, and in fact, the annual operations for the Colorado River reservoirs have to take into a lot of considerations that would include, I think, how to operate so as to fulfill the Endangered Species Act and put flows into the Grand Canyon for that wonderful rafting and, move the sediment, make the deliveries to the lower basin. We want to do a lot of things with our water. One thing I will predict with confidence is not going to happen is that no state is going to agree that we'll have less of an allocation than it was given under the compact. Right? Okay? The 7 basin states can modify the compact when they act jointly. Why do you think they are? Now, maybe Congress can do it through some congressional act. That's very interesting, since they have their hand on the valve. Upton Terrell, who wrote 2 volumes on the Colorado River, basically said it's a bargain with the devil to have the United States build these things, and we're going to rue the day they do. Well, the rue the day is the environmental overlay. So, Professor Sachs. Microphone over here. The public trust doctrine, and any other thing you'd like to talk about, Joe?
Well, you said 2 things that I thought were very interesting. I want to ask a question that arises out of them. One, you talked in a very positive way about some of the devices that dry year options, marketing, and so forth that are being innovated. But you also said that none of the Colorado River Basin states are going to agree to any change in their allocation. So my question is the following: wouldn't it be a good idea for there to be the possibility of marketing between the upper basin and the lower basin, in light of what you said, the good ideas that you said, and the kind of needs that we need
Of course,
to
you know,
fulfill?
that-
I'm trying to ask you an uncontroversial question.
You didn't ask anything but a highly relevant and controversial question. We had a state engineer that during Roy Romer's time got fired because he mentioned that maybe we ought to market across state lines, because we hadn't fully developed our entitlement yet and we should get some revenue for the schools. Romer fired him. Now, would he get fired today? I don't think so. I think that we're actually going to see something akin to the Indian reservations marketing water off a reservation that they can't entirely use for agriculture, but that they have these rights that need to be settled, the Winters Doctrine, Native American Reserve water rights. So I suspect, now, if it's done on a state-to-state level, here's the big bugaboo in California, and I think for Colorado, is that water that the upper basin can't use, since it's a beneficial use compact, goes to the lower basin. That's why California's been able to use more than its allotment, okay? Now combine that with the fact that if we really have a market system for private water rights, Colorado could never compete for the big money that would buy the private rights and take them out of state. So that explains Governor Romer's reaction, right? We can't have private markets accomplish this because the state, under the Voorhees case, if it considers water just as an ordinary article of commerce, that your conservation rationale for keeping the water in the state for your present and future development may disappear. Can states do it mano a mano among the 7 of them under shortage criteria? I would suspect they probably are going to get away with it. But they won't try to amend the compact to do that. They will have some kind of protocols, agreements, and so on, non-litigation agreements, you know. The upper basin would love to have a no-call provision by the lower basin, you know. We're scared to death now about this 75 million acre-feet 10-year running average, all right? What if we really, in climate change or these big drought circumstances that happened absent global warming, we didn't have Lake Powell filled or it was empty, you know? So we'd like to work with the other states. Now I'm parroting policy people. I'm standing outside of the judge role as a Coloradan. The compact always is being massaged for its unanswered questions and for pragmatic reality. So, yeah. Now, will the compact itself change? Will state water law change? People will say that that isn't what's happening when you do these things because, you know, it's kind of an emergency or shortage. And those are always kind of, you know, you do what you have to do in those circumstances. Over here. By the way, thanks those who need to leave. Appreciate it. Yeah, one or two more questions. Thank you.
Well, you talked about looking to past settled use as a way of moving forward and forming the cornerstones. Let me give you 2 examples which work against this. One is Indian water rights and the new Arizona doctrine of basing Indian water rights not on irrigable acreage, but on making the reservation a comfortable homeland and ensuring economic development. So that means you would look not to the way water was being used in the past. I have to say I'm working for the Hopi and the water rights claim in Arizona. But you have to look to the future. And so that seems to clash somewhat with your conceptual scheme of sort of starting with the past. Just a second example, climate change. So one way of thinking of it is that, most water rights in California for irrigation are for a particular period of time, which typically is the end of March, the beginning of April through September or October. And with climate change, we essentially lose March. And so the stream flow that you used to get at the beginning of April maybe will now exist only at the beginning of March or the end of February.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you do that? Could you just wholesale rewrite the laws and say, instead of April 1, it now becomes March 1? Suppose I, in anticipation of this, start arranging to divert water and get a right for the month of March or for the month of February. Am I then senior to all these other rights holders who realize 10 years from now that actually they need a right starting in February, not in April? And so see these both examples where if you look at the past, things have changed. In the second case, Mother Nature. In the first case, it's just a different way of thinking of things. And so, as it were, one can't avoid the brave new world.
Short response. Obviously, direct flow ditches with priorities past 1860 or 1870 based on the drought, can't bring in the water you need in a normal year, even. The overcapacity was already built in. So whatever water was available is taken on priority. The reservoir rights became the most valuable rights. The reservoir rights stored outside of the agricultural season. So one of the historic adaptations, you saw there that the Puebloans were doing it. The Oaxaca exercise shows a reservoir that was built 750 BC in the Scientific American study. They were already adapting to dry year climate change by storing water when they could. Okay? So that's one of the mechanisms. Now, can you take an agricultural right and make a new filing and go into March? I don't think so. I think you're stuck with your historic times of diversion. And if the water is not there, it's not there. The water right becomes less secure and less valuable. Is this a community problem? You bet it is. Conservation now is the first wave of water planning. And it's starting with the municipalities. And it's starting with keeping their reservoir water in storage just as long as they can, because I tell you, the Denver Water Board and other such folks that move the water out in an average year, much less a good year, are ruining the day they didn't keep the water in the bank. So I am convinced that, piping, lining, keeping the water in storage as long as you can, demand reduction, rates, all these things, because the infrastructure is so expensive to move water from agriculture, and the water rights are becoming so valuable that as an economic necessity, as well as a community ethic that's developing, it's demand management and conservation on the front end. Will they still have to acquire water rights? Will they hire engineers to see when the water may be available under global change scenarios? You bet they're doing that right now. And they're going to try to figure out what are the most valuable rights for that and what they need to go after. I think there's going to be more competition, more increase in value of these senior rights, not less. And the legislatures aren't going to be interested in taking away from the farmers the ability to market or lease those rights. That would be my guess. And the Native Americans, the homeland, very interesting concept, But the reserve water right operates outside of state law, so it isn't based on perfected use like the prior appropriation water rights. They had their marker on a certain quantity of water, and those settlements are crafting in community and in the Congress what that amount is and where it can be used and how it will be used for the benefit of the homeland, including off the reservation. I'm going to take one more question, then we got to adjourn, I guess.
I was just curious. You talked about the Mona Lake decision as being a public trust decision, but what about North Bloomfield and people versus the 1884 cases where the economy switched from mining to agriculture, to hydraulic miners? The farmers didn't buy water.
Right.
Became open to appropriation. Now, it would seem to me that climate change creates a situation much more akin to, figuring this out rather than just a whole-scale buying of the new users from the old.
Well, I've always had trouble with that hydraulic mining scenario because it's basically a non-consumptive use. In Colorado, our first water law was 1861, and the months of the first territorial legislature was only an agricultural law, because what it was recognizing was that that is a consumptive use and needed to be, water needed to be transported out of the stream and sometimes the long locations to do that. It wasn't until 1903 that Colorado allowed the adjudication of all the other types of water uses. You can't transfer a non-consumptive use to a consumptive use. We don't allow it in Colorado.
Well, that's what we're doing now in California.
Well, every state can shape its water law through its codes, customs, practice, and so on, and I say, have at it. But, I'm speaking as a judge that's looking at a body of law in cases that we have well-formulated doctrines for, where we don't allow the waste to be built into the consumptive use transfer if it occurred. You can only take the historic consumptive use measured over wet, average, and dry periods and move it. And that's because the return flows through the subsurface and the surface belong back to the public's resource to be used in order of priority by other users, including the in-stream flows that benefit from the return of this water. Whether you like the system or not, it does have some basic rationality to it. Would we do something different if we were the great urbanizing democracy in the 1800s? Maybe. In fact, the Denver Water Board argued as late as the 1980s, when Colorado recognized the reserve water rights doctrine, that there was a perpetual subordination to domestic use, because that's the highest priority for mankind, is domestic water supply. And the federal and state court of Colorado said, no darn way. We have all those settled uses that aren't domestic. That domestic use preference means that when you can't get water by any other device, you can condemn the water right and pay just compensation. That's how that domestic preference provision in our state constitution was viewed, because otherwise the municipalities would have the upper hand, always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.